I can stand here for ages watching the little waves chasing each other up the shore, watching the tide going in and out, backwards and forwards, smoothing out all the footprints of the day's traffic on the sand as it goes. Some spring tides will reach right up to the promenade and then retreat all the way back down, leaving silver sheets of wet sand, like it is now. Let's go in and have a cup of tea. Don't worry, I'm pretty sure the sea will still be there when we've finished. Hello, I'm Peter John Cooper. I've often stood on the cliff and wondered whether, if the tide goes out far enough, would it ever come back in again? Here's my story, which is a sort of homage to the Ray Bradbury story, The Day It Rained Forever. It's called The Day the Tide Went Out Forever. Now, I disremember exactly when it was. Where's that drink to? I'll need something to wet my whistle. It might help me remember. Ah, yes. Tuesday, was it? Or no, Wednesday? No, it couldn't have been the Tuesday because that's the day the bus goes into town and everyone skedaddles off for to go up at the shop windows. Let's say Wednesday then. Well, it was there when I looked in the morning and that night it had gone. Well, we thought, spring tide, of course. It could go a fair way out on the spring tide, and with a bit of wind behind it. Anyway, there was all these families and so on the beach as usual, and the tide were right out. Stripy awnings and big umbrellas, little wisps of smoke from those little barbecue things they bring. Although, why they'd rather have burnt sausages rather than a good plateful of cod and chips you can get very reasonable from Martha's Chippy at the bottom of the high street. Anyway, there they all were, like little camps of refugees eating their burnt sausages, and in the morning, there they were, still there. I mean, usually, when the tide to come in at night, they'll get hooched up off the sand onto the front, back into their cars and so on, off home. But come the morning, now that must have been the Thursday. Well, if it was the Wednesday the day before, that's how it works, see? So yeah, Thursday morning, they were still all on the beach. And some of them had moved even further out, right out level with the headland. A great flat expanse of sand with little bunches of families and kiddies with buckets and spades and so on. Everything you want on a beach. Except there weren't no sea for them to play in. Then somebody wanders in and says they've been up on the headland and there's no water right out into the channel. It's all sand and a few rocks with dried out seaweed clinging to them. Right out as far as you can see. Well, where's the water to, Len? I says. And Len scratches his head and says he's buggered if he knows. Now, Len is on the Coast Guard, and does a bit of line fishing, sea bass and so on. So you think he'd know if anyone would? Somebody says we ought to ring the council and see if they had anything to do with it, but nobody had the right change for the phone box, so we didn't bother. Then Len says, what worries me is if it's a tsunami. And he goes on, when there's a big earthquake at sea, the water all gets sucked up into the ocean, and then it all rushes back in a huge wave, hundreds of feet tall, with enormous destruction and extensive loss of life. So they say on the news. Well, they have them in other countries, so why shouldn't we? Is that what we got here then, Len, we says. And Len scratches his chin in that way he has. If we have, it goes on, then all those families out there and all they kiddies are going to get drowned with the giant wave, as it were. True enough. And we all gaze at him in a pitying sort of way. Job for the Coast Guard, Len. Lots of work for you. Move 'em all off the beach. Yes, says Len. Although we was all a bit doubtful that anyone would take any notice of him. Len not being the most forceful individual, if you get my drift. And all those visitors having such a high old time. Although, says Len, I reckon if there was going to be a tidal wave, it would probably have turned up by now. That's how it works on the news anyway. What we ought to do, he says in his best Coast Guard manner, is go and look where the sea has got to. We'll need to drive. So somebody goes along to Vic's garage to see if we can use his old army surplus 3-tonner that has got 4-wheel drive and low ratio, sort of proper job for what we wants to do. And in a while he's back with Vic at the wheel. Vic wasn't going to let anyone loose on his pride and joy, that's for sure. Anyway, we all piles in and sets off down the beach and out past the headland. Well, none of us had been out there except in boats, and we was all interested to see how all the bits and pieces of rocks and reefs look like looking up instead of in a boat looking down. Well, not a lot different really. Old Mike Townsend was happy to see a string of his lobster pots where he'd lost them in that big storm a couple of weeks ago. And we came across all sorts of old gear, containers and things, some of it quite nice, and we all decided to come back and pick it up by way of salvage, although Len pointed out you couldn't have the rules of salvage at sea if there weren't no sea, and there would be no end of wrangling by lawyers about what might be legally salvageable in these circumstances. One thing we did find, which gave us all a bit of a smile, was a long line with floats attached either end, and a lot of packages, all wrapped up in black plastic attached. We all nodded and winked at each other and thought we weren't going to bother the lawyers with that, thank you. Further out was an old wreck where many of the chaps with boats made a few bob over the summer transporting divers out and bringing them back again. Many of them still alive. And that was all rusted and fallen to bits and covered in barnacles, and the divers had had the propellers and the ship's bell and the bronze fittings away years ago, so nothing for us there. somebody points to something like a big sack draped over a rock. Len gets down to have a look, official-like. When he gets back in the lorry, he's a bit quiet. "What is it, Len?" we says. And after a while, he says, "Buggered if it wasn't a mermaid." We all looks at each other. "Did you kiss alive?" "No use," says Len. "Dried out in the sunshine. Desiccated." After that, we sort of lost interest in what we was doing, and besides, there were too many shoals and gullies and soft mud past the headland, and even though we had not found out what had become of the sea, we decided we'd gone far enough. Vic was getting anxious about his precious Bedford in case it got stuck, so we turned round and drove back home, none the wiser. In the pub that night, everyone had an idea what had happened, apart from Len's tsunami idea, that is. Some said aliens. Some said it must be the electricity who could have dammed up the channel for a hydroelectric scheme. Another theory held that it must be an experiment by the army that had gone wrong, or the RAF, or more likely the Navy. Something to do with death rays, probably. We couldn't decide which was more likely, but the general feeling that it was something nuclear anyway. In the end, we decided that somebody would really have to ring the council in the morning, sort it out. As it happened, next day the sea was back just as normal, so we thought we'd save the cost of a phone call and not bother them with it. Here, you got that drink yet? Thank you for listening to that. I must say I had a lot of fun recording it and writing it. Before you rush off to social media to discuss which army surplus Bedford 3-tonner Vic owned, I'll give you some hints here. The original Bedford OY did not have four-wheel drive. The more recent RL, the basis for all those Green Goddess fire engines that used to appear in emergencies, was for much of its life rated at 4 tons by the Army. So I think we must assume it was the wartime QL that Vic polished lovingly at weekends. If you have a different view, well, it's my story, so I can make anything I like fit the bill. And, to be frank, if that is what annoyed you most about this story, then this podcast may not be the one for you. If you'd like to get in touch with me, with any other aspect of life on the cliff edge, please leave a message on Facebook page Tales from the Cliff Edge, or on my podcast site peterjohncooper.podbean.com. See you again soon.